what was Tesla, Nikola Tesla, the famed inventor and scientist, really doing? That Gerry does do a lot of tinkering in these fields. He's been researching the lives of many of the turn-of-the-century scientists, these obscure scientists that were doing very interesting and work that just still isn't recognized today. They're also ahead of their time. And Gerry does a lot of his own experiments and research, plumbing archives. He also, by the way, last time he was on the show, mentioned a device, a simple device, inexpensive, that you can put into the ground, just a rod, and how to hook it up to your radio so you can get better radio reception. He'll tell us more about that. Welcome back, Gerry.
It's a great pleasure to be back.
Gerry, I really appreciate all that your insights into Tesla. Number one, you're a teacher, so you're used to taking high concepts and making them very understandable to an audience. You've done your own tinkerings, as we mentioned, which gives you some invaluable insight. And you just love to sit in libraries and archives and research all day. And so I appreciate that you go out and do that and then give us the benefit of those many hours spent in research. So you have a very gifted perspective here. And of all the people that I've heard talk about Tesla, some that you'd figure, they don't even know science. I mean, I don't know that much science, and I know they don't know any more than I do. But there's a lot of people that talk about Tesla. So I trust you when you talk about Tesla.
The library archive type research is very rewarding, and too few people are out there doing it.
Not that many people enjoy it like you do. So.
Yeah, there's so much there, and it's a devotion that I've given myself to some 20 years now. On to Tesla.
So Tesla felt that following his heart. And he was a very moral man. I mean, you hear stories about Tesla not engaging in certain activities because he felt it was bad for the world or immoral activities or...
Oh, yes.
Could you tell us a little bit about Tesla's philosophy?
Well, yes, really the story starts in his childhood. He was born in a mystically inclined family. His father was an Eastern Orthodox priest. And he came from a line of very famous individuals. Most of them were in the military or in the clergy, certainly intellectually gifted people. His mother was very insightful, intuitive, we would call it. And Nikola Tesla, as a young child, was given to very profound and deep visions in which he would see machines hanging before him. He was able to walk around these because they appeared solid to him. And he could walk around these and examine them. And once actually questioned one of his older sisters whether or not they could see these things. And his sister scolded him. But his mother, of course, was always there to the rescue, and she understood what was happening. And she encouraged him to honor these visions, but always to keep his feet firmly planted on the ground.
Good advice.
So he was a very playful child, on what we understand. And he was thoroughly involved in the country life of the day. Always getting into things, getting in and out of scrapes, and wasn't really the odd person that he's been painted and portrayed to be. As he grew older and went to the university, it probably was a shock to him to realize that the scientific world was taking a turn away from the romantic science or the experiential science that he had grown to love, and very quickly found the coldness that was spreading through Europe and the European universities as they were trying to mechanize the world, more or less. And the mechanistic movement, which portrayed the world as a machine, was absolutely abhorrent to Tesla. And so Tesla sought some kind of explanation for this new shift in paradigm, and he found his deepest answers in reading the scientific books of Goethe, Johann von Goethe. And very few people realize that Goethe was not just a brilliant poet and playwright, but at first he spent a great deal of time investigating nature, using his intuition and his experiential powers to explore nature and to describe it. He wrote volumes and volumes and volumes of scientific texts. And so Tesla studied these books with deep devotion and always referred to these throughout his life. And in this study, he realized the importance of the heart and of the intellect and of experience in exploring nature. So there you have his real romantic leanings, if you will.
I'm Laura Lee. Our guest is Gerry Vassilatos. Gerry, what's the title of your book on HAARP?
Oh, Secrets of Cold War Technology.
That is available at the Radio Bookstore at 1-800-243-1438. It's a fascinating read. Also, Gerry, you have a new video, Tesla's New York, which we'll talk about a little bit later. It's a walk through Tesla's haunts and the place he frequented and where he had lunch and where he took his walks, where he did his experiments, where his labs were, all of that with Gerry narrating and giving other stories about the life and the loves of Tesla. It also is available at the Radio Bookstore if this is a topic that intrigues you. Gerry, you were just mentioning this division of science from, and also this division from, it seems, our society's strategy of life. You know, let's rely on the intellect alone and let's let go of the heart and the intuition and just what we experience. And it seems to have gotten us in a bit of a muddle. There's a movement now to reclaim those tools, the intuition and our experience. And I think this is giving rise to interest in the paranormal and the exotic and the fringe because it necessarily expands our boundaries. I'm very interested in this topic, doing the show that I do, of course. You're also interested in this because a lot of your experiments and research has been to reclaim this territory from a scientific point of view. And so this is a key crossroads, isn't it? And it's interesting that Tesla also early in his life made a conscious decision. And I think this is what, to include that living energy of the universe and to go with his visions, his intuition, to help that inform him. Other great scientists like Victor Schauberger took all of his clues from watching nature and observing nature and came up with some very much ahead of his time and inventions that are even today not understood. So this seems to be a tack that you can take. Let's listen to nature and see what she has to say. I think that the pursuit of Tesla is very important because as he was trying to put which you're going to talk about, a technology together that could actually enhance human consciousness, I think this is something that is still of interest today, and there's a need for this today. Perhaps we can still rediscover these secrets and improve on the technology and where we're going, what we're doing with it. And I think that this I think there's a good chance of this happening because as our society becomes more and more accepting of those other tools, intuition and experience, I think the strategy will follow both in our personal lives and in the sciences and what we're opening up to. I think this is a very exciting time in which to live. So I just wanted to point out the importance of this crossroads and how this is a key arena that we explore in the show, that you explore in your work, and that I think society today is exploring. Go ahead with Tesla, if you will.
Well, I was going to amplify on what you just said. I concur wholeheartedly. We're at a crossroads because mechanistic science is not providing real answers for people. And the answers which Carl Sagans and all the other mechanists are providing are not humanly valuable. In other words, they don't fill that part of us that is truly curious.
Well, I don't think that we need to throw out where we've been. I don't think we need to throw out what Western science and civilization has contributed. I think we just need to add on to it. If it offers us half the equation, let's go include the other half. I think the same argument is true with naturopathic versus allopathic medicine. Both are valid. It's not a contest of either or. It's both are valuable and necessary to make a complete medicine. So I would say that modern science has done some invaluable contributions, but if it's half the equation, let's go gain the other half of the coin, the missing territory that can inform us in the ways of consciousness. That's my perspective on it, but go ahead.
Yeah, I know. I differ with this view a little bit because if you really look at the roots of Western science, you find that it was entirely qualitative. And I just wanted to point out that, you see, somebody like Goethe represents one of these nexus points. He was a person who summed up all the previous qualitative, esoteric scientific knowledge and re-expounded it to the future. And people like Tesla picked up on him. Basically what Goethe was saying was that when you look at nature, you must not filter your experience of nature to include only descriptions of mechanical motions or movements, or descriptions of superficial qualities of the universe. In other words, when you're out in a meadow, it's not enough just to describe, let's say, the wind blowing across a meadow and making wheat oscillate back and forth. It's not enough to describe the movement of the wheat. There's so much more of our experience. 99% of our experience, if not more than 99, probably 99.999 of our experience entails all the senses, all the impressions we receive, all the emotional impacts that nature impresses us with. And what I'm seeing in the quantitative sciences, and I was trained as a quantitative scientist, I studied geophysics. Basically, what's happening in that science is that they're describing the world in terms of kinematics, just mechanical movements. Well, where's the other 99.999 of my experience?
Arts and literature, I guess. I don't know.
Well, yeah, and certainly when you're out in the field, and if you're a scientific observer, there's a million things going on. I mean, you're feeling things, you're sensing things, you're imagining things. Impressions are coming to you. They usually come as images. And so someone like Goethe would suggest that all of this is part of the message in nature and should be included in the observations. And Tesla certainly...
How do you put that in a scientific manner, though? But anyway, what was Tesla doing?
Well, the scientific matter we would describe would be more like poetry.
Mm-hmm.
And
art and literature. Mm-hmm.
Yes, and basically what we're talking about in science, and it's a very desperate issue, is to recognize just how deep this world is. If we look at the world as made of atoms, then I suppose it would be justified to just talk about the mechanics of the world. But if the world is deeper than atoms, if it's made of metaphors, for example, then the atoms are just some kind of byproduct of the metaphors. And this is what the ancient view of the world was. That's why when they pictured the world, the physical world was always bound in a sea of blue and then into black, because that represented the metaphysical world. And so the ancient scientists would say, well, the physical world is actually created, generated, and supported by the metaphysical world. So that's where the blend and the continuity come through. Tesla was a believer in that, basically.
Which gave rise to his theory of the ether.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah.
And you had mentioned last time that without that ether, then his experiments really, you can't understand them as deeply as...
Right. And we also can't understand ancient science apart from these concepts. Because if we look at ancient science, and there's a line that goes from ancient science to Paracelsus, to Goethe, to Tesla, and to us through him. If you look at ancient science, basically what you're looking at is a science based in metaphysical awarenesses. And the physical was generated by the metaphysical. So what was always being searched out was the intermediary, and that was the ether.
Gerry Vassilatos is our guest. He has both a book and video out, much to do with Nikola Tesla. Gerry was a guest on our show some weeks ago. He was talking about HAARP, the High Frequency Active Auroral Research Project. In Gerry's estimation, HAARP is an attempt to recreate a Tesla technology. That is, to activate the ionosphere to produce electricity, to activate a grid system to send out electricity to the world. However, in the case of HAARP, they would meter it. Tesla's idea was to electrify the world or use the world as a source of free and abundant electricity, and also, as Gerry will tell us, a means to put out a vibration that would enhance consciousness and not charge for it, and make this stunning contribution to the world. You know, there was a time in 1931 in July, as I mentioned, where Time magazine featured Tesla on its cover with the caption, Nikola Tesla, the world's his powerhouse. So this idea, this technology was once widely known. In fact, Tesla was a media star in his day. Now the textbooks hardly mention Tesla. How did that come to be? How could you be one of the most widely quoted and glamorous scientists of your day, and then, 50 years later, nobody's ever hardly heard of you except people like Gerry who research this, and those people keeping alive his life and work, and the few institutions around that are memorials to his work. How does that happen? And the other question is, what exactly was Tesla doing? Gerry says that the current HAARP, in his estimation, and again, I want to point out this is just Gerry's theory. This is not a fact. It's not proven. It's his working theory, but an intriguing one, and one which we covered in depth a few weeks ago. But if, as Gerry says, this is a misguided attempt, the current HAARP project, to electrify the world because it's misguided, because they don't really understand what Tesla was all about, then the question begs, well, what was Tesla really doing? Gerry has just explained to us that you must understand Tesla's take on science, that it must be informed by the heart and the intuition, and that Tesla was able to visualize in 3D and even walk around his inventions. I understand, Gerry, that he could walk away, come back to them weeks later, and he could see the kind of wear and tear that some of his prototype inventions would really have, so that by the time he built them, he built pretty perfect models of his inventions. He didn't go through a lot of the stages. He did that in consciousness. And that you must understand the ether theory. So, Gerry, what was Tesla's ether theory?
Well, it's an interesting segue from the vision to the ether, because Tesla began to believe, in fact, was firmly convinced that the visions he was receiving were parts of the fundamental nature of the world. In other words, archetypes, symbols, models, ideas. This is what really made the world. And the pressure of these on the world is what created this primary matter called ether. And that this was eventually built up into the substance that we knew as the world, the forms and all of the animate and biological organizations that we see. And Tesla came to believe that he might have been one of these intermediary personalities. In other words, visionaries, in his estimation, were people who were sensitive to the metaphoric structure, the infrastructure of the world, and through whom the embodiments, let's say, of technology would come. In other words, he would see the vision, he would embody it in a form, and then release it to humanity. And so basically, his search was to find what the intermediate material was of consciousness. In other words, he was looking for what went between ideal form, visions, and the physical embodiment of the world. So,
what was the veil made up of?
Yes, exactly. So he was a staunch believer in this immaterial ether. Now, at the time, there were many views of ether, and certainly the Victorians at the beginning used the term to refer to ectoplasm and the human aura, for example. And we're going to hear this later on when we talk about Tesla's idea of human energy. Human energy was a phrase used to identify the human aura or consciousness. And so this was also termed ether. As the end of the century came, Victorian scientists began to quantify this idea, and they began to look for a gaseous ether. And Tesla began to look for a gaseous ether.
And this was just prior to the turn of the century, right?
Yes.
When science really hadn't kicked out the ether theory for good, as it has today.
Right.
Although you said that there's been a misinterpretation of the ether theories. They were set up wrongly, they were misinterpreted, and so they really proved nothing in your estimation.
So now Tesla was also apprised of certain of these realities, because much of his efforts towards the end of his life were actually engaged with achieving those ends.
Oh, so with Tesla's extraordinary capabilities of vision, you're saying,
yes.
He tried some very interesting experiments towards the end of his life, and those are in his diaries?
Well, they're not in his diaries, but they're cleverly placed throughout his arranged newspaper interviews. He would arrange for a media interview in which he would leak information. Tesla went through a lot of personal tragedy and loss as a result of his discoveries and his announcements, chiefly at the hands of people like J.P. Morgan,
which we'll talk about later.
And basically what he stopped doing after a while was he literally stopped patenting things after 1929 or thereabouts, and he began to secretize a lot of his information and then leak it to the newspaper so that the public would get it.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, or to science.
So many other great scientists did that as well.
Yes.
Like Da Vinci.
So what we need to do is perhaps start talking about Tesla's idea of the ether.
Okay.
And,
well, where did that lead him? How did he apply it? With all of his other inventions, you say the ether, his understanding and belief in the ether is at the core of it. So when we come back, if you could explain that to us and give us some new context in which to understand this very fascinating man who was well ahead of his time. We'll see if we can catch up. How did such a media star in his day become so obscure by today, where he's hardly even mentioned in textbooks? That's one question I have. Gerry's explaining. And also, what was Tesla really doing? What was the nature of his experiments? How did he try to turn the world, the earth itself, into a power source? And Gerry, you're telling us about the ether and how Tesla was coding some of his ideas so that people would get it. Tell me more about, how is he applying his ether theory? When he and he was going against the grain of science, which was trying to throw out the ether by that time, what was he actually doing? How did this inform his experiments?
Well, he basically was looking for that, as we said, the intermediary between vision and substance. So he made an accidental discovery in 1892, which very few Tesla enthusiasts even know about. And fewer of his biographers ever mention this particular moment, but Tesla discovered that very sharp and violent electrical discharges, sparks, if properly arranged, would release this pressure wave that also had a stinging quality to them. And indeed, Tesla was surprised to find that these pressure waves with the stinging quality would go right through metals. And that was not supposed to happen, according to the laws of electrodynamics. So when he realized what exactly was happening here, he believed he was finding a little crack in the door toward his real goal. And his goal was to find that intermediary. And sure enough, he did. He realized that what was happening there was the release of an etheric type of pressure. And he published this in 1892, around the Christmas season, in the Electrician magazine, in his regular monthly column there. So, having realized that he was able to somehow create movements in the ether, he set about to try to harness this energy and learn all about it. So his first couple of experiments, which took several years, was developing very powerful generators of this force. And during that time period, he developed the famous Tesla transformer, which is nothing like these Tesla coils, which most people believe have their origins with Nikola Tesla. Tesla's true transformers produce an entirely different kind of energy. Indeed, this is what he was doing. He was separating what we call electricity from ether, and in his certain components that he was developing. So he was splitting apart these two different currents and using the etheric current that was flowing. And so this was a very radiant form of energy, and he called it radiant energy.
How do you mean radiant? How? What does that mean in this context?
Well, for example, one of his components was a magnetic discharge device where he passed a very abrupt electrical current between two magnets, very strong magnets. And what would happen was this. The bluish sparks, the electrons, and the positive charges would fly out of they would be pushed out of the magnetic field. But there was always this continual stream of white current that moved straight across, as if it wasn't even influenced by the magnetic field, which meant that this was not really an electrical current. So this white energy, this white fire energy, appeared in his coils, and he found ways of amplifying this. And he could focus this energy, and he found ways of propelling it in such a way that it would go right through walls, right through metal. And the energy actually caused the air to fluoresce. It would turn white, depending upon how fast the pulsations were. Now, this was a pulsating field, sort of like a heartbeat. Now, he was known for working with these alternating currents, but this was not an alternating current effect. In fact, he stopped working with alternating currents after this. He was entirely occupied with pulsating currents, currents that go in one direction, and that pulse in one direction. So this energy was very powerful, could be beamed, literally beamed, to any location. And he did experiments all over New York City, in the northern extremities of the city, areas that we now call Central Park and Uptown. Mm-hmm. And he did these experiments out in the meadows and discovered some really phenomenal qualities that this ether current had. For example, the longer the transformers were left operating, the larger the sphere of fluorescence. In other words, the air would start to fluoresce a whitish color, and it would just expand outward. In other words, you could literally see yourself in this field of light. So it was a very strange kind of light that was coming out, and it was cold light. So this is, in brief, I mean, there's so many details in his technology, but in brief, this is what he was working with. And he called it radiant energy because this was an energy that could be moved. It could be beamed from point to point.
So it did not follow the same laws that electricity followed.
That's right. That's right. It was
a
totally different current. And he goes to great lengths to describe this. I mean, I don't understand when people just miss this point, because if you miss this point, you miss Tesla.
Tonight's a Tesla night. Our guest, Gerry Vassilatos, author of Secrets of Cold War Technology. Gerry, 2 quick questions. Just give me a quick answer, and then let's go on. Zero-point energy, Hal Puthoff is working very hard. Zero-point energy is a concept that's been around for, 20 years or so. A lot of scientists are now trying to tap energy from the void these days. These are fringe scientists. It seems to me that there's some relationship here, and this is a living energy related to Qi and Qi and the space between the atoms. So is this a similar concept? The next question is, I thought that once you disturb this ether, and maybe Tesla has a different understanding of what ether is, and so clarify this for me, but once you disturb this vast sea of potentiality, it's no longer implicate, it's become explicate, so it's changed form. It's something else now.
Yes.
And everything rises from this, so, when you start shaking it around, suddenly you get other stuff. Quick answers, and then the question, so Tesla discovered this ether, how to activate it, how to tap it. What was he going to do with it? What's the next chapter in the story?
Well, to talk, I think it's very interesting that Hal Puthoff is involved in zero-point energy now, and has shifted research thesis several times. I think the quantum view of zero-point energy is different from Tesla's view of ether.
Okay.
To explain Tesla's idea of ether, we have to go back to Dmitri Mendeleev, otherwise known as the father of the periodic table. Mendeleev predicted the existence of several elements, gaseous elements, that preceded hydrogen.
Okay.
And he wrote a booklet about this. And he described what these elements would be like. He called it his zero series. And these were gases which were also inert gases. Okay. In other words, they wouldn't chemically combine with anything, and they were possessed of such a high velocity and such a vanishingly small mass. And in his view, they were much smaller than what we call electrons nowadays.
Mm-hmm.
And so this would explain how this material, this ether, was able to zip in and out of matter, things we would call matter, and to ether particles moving at such a high velocity and not chemically combining with anything. Well, this stuff could zip in and out of matter as we would think it's solid, but...
And so it's a gaseous, which is what Tesla saw ether as a gaseous form.
Right, and Tesla concurred with Mendeleev because Tesla saw this in action. And Mendeleev said that this came from the stars and from the sun, where matter was so highly pulverized that it would reach these highly divided states.
Oh, dark matter, you could say. Okay.
Right. So Tesla applied his energies to these special globes which he made, which had carbon buttons in the center, sort of like a carbon globule in the center. And they were highly evacuated globes. And what he discovered was that upon applying this special current, the carbon would become white, and a pressure could be felt all around the globe by the hand. You could literally feel this pushing pressure. In some cases, the globes would puncture, and instead of imploding, like a vacuum tube or a vacuum bulb would implode, they would just continue pressing out this gaseous substance. You could hear it. And Eric Dollard has vindicated all of these claims of Tesla. He's reproduced most of these effects, so we know that these things are true. So Tesla intended to use this energy to broadcast this energy, in other words, to distant locations without wires. And this was a radical departure from all his previous work in polyphase alternating current, where you needed wires to connect the generator with the consumer. This takes us to J.P. Morgan, if you'd like to go into that at this point.
Yes, please.
Sure. Well, you see, Tesla and Westinghouse had become partners, and Tesla became fabulously wealthy by this time. He was a multimillionaire. And we're talking about in the 1880s and 90s, where a nickel could buy you an afternoon's lunch, So he enjoyed a very luxurious life. He was approached by J.P. Morgan, who decided he was going to become Tesla's partner. And typical Morgan fashion, he would just muscle in.
He knew a good thing when he saw it, yeah.
Well, more than that, he would literally force his way in. There wasn't much finesse in the man. He was a very ruthless individual, and he had placed his money on Edison and on direct current, and Edison's system was failing. And when Tesla and Westinghouse came up with their system for alternating current, it was more efficient and could be handled more easily. Morgan decided he was going to make them his partner. And so Tesla really informed Morgan right off. He said, well, I don't need a partner, and I'm a millionaire now too, so have a good day, basically. And Morgan basically threatened him and said, you're going to need me someday, and this is a big mistake. So what Morgan did for the interim period until his next meeting with Tesla, Morgan monopolized everything having to do with power line technology, cables, cable companies, wire, insulator companies, steel, you name it, buying up the patents that had to do with power lines. And then returned to Tesla and said, well, look, you turned me down the first time. Now you're going to have to make me a partner, and this time the stakes are going to be higher. I'm going to have like 70% of the profits. You won't be able to ship your electricity to your consumers without my power lines because I own them now. I own the whole thing, lock, stock, and barrel. And Tesla's retort was, well, have a seat. I want to show you a few things. You should have been reading the scientific journals instead of spending your time and money in a rage. And Tesla proceeded to show him some of his developments in wireless power broadcast, which absolutely dumbfounded Morgan. He was thunderstruck by this, and he wasn't endeared by it, put it that way. Tesla's plan was to broadcast power. Now, I wouldn't call it broadcast electricity because it really wasn't electricity. It was this etheric current. And Tesla found uses for it. In other words, he found ways of applying this energy, this strange energy. He found ways of turning it into light. He found ways of making motors turn with it. He found ways of turning it into heat.
And this was without converting it to electricity first?
Without converting it into electricity first. It was a radiant beam of energy. He could broadcast it in all directions, or he could beam it in one single direction. So he had several plans for broadcasting energy across the countryside. One plan was to beam it between projector tubes placed on tall towers. And it had characteristics unlike any other kind of energy that we know nowadays.
Such as?
Well, it could pass through most substances unhindered. And he developed ways of pulsating this flow. And what one of his great discoveries about this energy was, depending upon the pulsations, this energy would interact with matter in different ways. So
it would interact with matter?
Yeah, he could make it interact or not interact. In other words,
it dangerous to the human body? Was it?
It depended on the pulsations. In other words, if he had them at a certain, for example, when he first discovered this energy, it gave him a shocking, stinging sensation, which was very irritating, which was dangerous. And so what he did was he figured out a way to increase the number of pulsations per second. So as he did this, he noticed that the pain went away. And at a certain point, as the pain was departing, he could feel a pressure, a strong pressure. And mechanical pressure was one of the features at a certain rate of pulsation. Then after that, what would happen is you would feel heat, intense heat, body permeating heat. And then after that, you would see this white light filling space. And then after that, there would be a cool sensation. And one more step after that was suddenly your thoughts and your consciousness became highly clarified. Oh. So he had discovered an entirely new spectrum of energies, and these were ray-type energies. He likened them to light. He said this is in several of his patents, he describes this energy. He says this is a form of light. It's a dark form of light, he called it. So he could focus the energy on metals, for example, and just by adjusting the pulsations, he could make the metal melt. At the same time, he could let it pass through his body in certain instances. There was an experiment he used to do where he would put his hand on top of the terminal, and in his free hand, he would carry a bar of metal. Now, he himself was left unharmed, but the metal would just melt or sometimes even explode. And he could show by this that the energy was absolutely harmless to humans. So basically, to make a long story short, his plan was to broadcast this power, and that would put J.P. Morgan out. And Morgan was thunderstruck, eyed Tesla with vengeance in his heart. Shortly after his meeting with Morgan, Tesla received a calling card, and that was his laboratory was burnt down for him. Actually, it was an assassination attempt. Tesla was known to work in the top of his laboratory all night long, and unbeknownst to the people who set the fire, and we know that the fire was set for certain reasons I'll go into, Tesla had walked out of his laboratory, probably through another exit which he had, and went to Delmonico's for an extended dinner. And as he came back, the laboratory was exploding, literally exploding. Floor upon floor was falling down. One of my discoveries in going through the area of town where his laboratory was to realize the construction of these buildings. These were heavily constructed buildings. Floors would not just because of fire. I mean, certainly if you could get one of these buildings to get on fire, that would be a miracle in itself. But how you could get floor upon floor to collapse would not be the result of an ordinary fire. It would have to be charges and gasoline and such. So this was a death attempt on Tesla, and he escaped.
And you think J.P. Morgan was behind it?
Oh, no doubt about it.
And did Tesla think so as well?
Oh, yes. In fact, what he did was he realized that Morgan was under suspicion because every eye was watching this. What was going on with Tesla was news. So Tesla made it very public and said, well, I appeal to the generosity of J.P. Morgan to help me in this time of need. And Morgan had to come up with the money to fund the building of another laboratory.
And why was that?
Well, because Morgan was under suspicion.
Oh, okay. Now, how far back did this set Tesla, the loss of his lab?
Well, it set him back to the extent that it was a personal tragedy, the first acquaintance with grief that he had in America. Well, maybe the second. The first acquaintance with grief was at the hands of Edison, who cheated him after he designed for Tesla certain types of DC generators. And he never received royalties for them. Edison just...
Or recognition.
No recognition for this. And so that was the first time. The second time was this tragedy, this fire. And Tesla wasn't prepared for that. He believed that Morgan was a gentleman and, all of these gentlemanly virtues would flow, And he believed that the United States was a land of free enterprise. He didn't think that there were mobsters in the halls of finance. And he found out, what the score was here. And so it set him back to the extent that he wasn't able to make proper demonstration as quickly as he would have liked to of his broadcast power system.
But he picked up in his new lab, and did Morgan have a piece of him now that he built the lab?
No, not at all.
And then Tesla went from there. So, Gerry, what did Tesla do next? He built his laboratory again after the fire.
Yes, and he did that with J.P. Morgan's help, which was kind of like a joke to Tesla, I believe. What Tesla began to do next was historically important in terms of world power broadcasting. What Tesla discovered was that when you attach one of these transmitters of his to the ground and you activate it, suddenly the intensity of the radiant energy coming up was incredibly amplified. And he discovered this out in Central Park, up towards the northern limits of the city. So what he did was he brought several of these units out to the meadows and grounded them, activated them probably with small gasoline engines. And he observed the tremendous magnification of power when he ran these at certain frequencies, of pulsating frequencies. And so he had to come up with an answer for why this etheric power was apparently resident in the earth in huge reservoirs. And his idea was this. The stars and the sun, principally, propel this ether gas throughout the cosmos. Apparently, he believed that the upper layers of the earth could absorb a large amount of this particle energy. It's particulate and very much smaller than electrons. So he came to believe that the earth was a reservoir. He had empirical proof of this, too, that the earth was a reservoir of this energy, and all he'd have to do is pump it and cause it to surge out, in other words, to vent it. And once he got this reservoir of ether operating, moving, then he could cause it to pass into his transmitters, and from there he could beam it to anywhere he wanted.
And because the solar flares and the sun and the earth was bathed by this daily, it was replenished daily, therefore it would never be exhausted.
Exactly. Okay. Now, we're not talking about electrons here. We're not talking about electricity. It's an entirely different kind of energy. So this is when he proposed the experiment in Colorado. And he went to Colorado Springs.
And why Colorado Springs, by the way?
Well, at the time, it was the Wild West. And he wanted to get as far away from civilization as possible. cities, because there were some dangers that he was aware of. One of the dangers was this. He was concerned with the fact that if he started an etheric flow, he might not be able to stop it.
And it might build up and have unpredictable consequences.
Well, yes, and he saw what it could do to the atmosphere. He saw what it could do to objects of matter. And the first thing he discusses in several of his magazine interviews was the possibility of splitting the Earth in two. And he was serious. He said that if you got the ether moving fast enough and in a coherent enough stream, it might cause such a bombardment on the inner matter of the Earth that it might cause a heating effect, and he believed it might be possible to actually cause some kind of a fissure to take place. And he was really concerned about that. The other thing was that he was concerned that it might literally ignite the nitrogen in the atmosphere and cause a nitrogen-oxygen reaction and burn away the atmosphere. And then, of course, he was concerned that this upwelling fountain of radiant energy might not be able to be stopped, sort of like a tornado of energy. And he was concerned about a runaway reaction. So he proceeded with great caution, and he took it out beyond the prying eyes of Morgan and all of his other financial enemies. And I think he much enjoyed being out there because it was the frontier at the time. And he took it up to the mountains. He found a plateau and he got the land.
And he must have done some experiments to quiet his fears on these three issues.
Well, yes. And shortly after he made these announcements, of course, we know that he did his experiments in Central Park to get some preliminary information. And I believe what he found was this. If you get ether moving in the Earth, the bombardment of ether on the matter of the Earth actually starts producing electrons. So you have two energy forms to contend with. One, the etheric, and then the other one would be the electronic. And he found, to his surprise and relief, that the electrons would literally slow down the reaction for him.
Okay.
So as the ether was being propelled through the Earth up into his transmitter, so he could broadcast it out,
the electronic was kind of a drag on it.
Right, exactly. So the electron formation would drag. And, of course, there were two waves that he had to describe. One would be the ether wave, which is not like a wave like we know it. Basically, it was more like a fountain effect. And he called this his stationary wave. And there would be the follow-up wave, the electrons, that would bounce up and down throughout the Earth, sort of like a spherical horizon that would just rise up and down. And that he called the standing wave. And most Tesla students don't get the difference between the two. And they think he was entirely involved in electrons, electrical science, and they missed this point. His ether stationary wave was the power source. The electrons were the drag.
Hi, we are back on the Lorelei Show in the midst of a discussion with Gerry Vassilatos on Nikola Tesla. What was he doing? What was the basis of his experiments and the free flow of radiant energy? There's a difference there, as Gerry had explained. And what was the nature of his tower to broadcast this power? Gerry is the author of Secrets of Cold War Technology, Project HARP and Beyond, has several good chapters on Nikola Tesla's work, and he has a video, Tesla's New York. It's a walkthrough of the haunts, the places in New York City where Tesla frequented, lived, had his laboratories, did his experiments, had lunch, and lots of good stories as well. Gerry's also at work on a series about obscure scientists around the turn of the century, of which Tesla was one, and we will talk with him further as that book becomes available. We'll talk with Gerry about many of these scientists to which he has delved into the archives, looked at their research, conducted his own experiments, and written up about it in very understandable language, considering the technical nature of this topic. Gerry, when I was during the break, I'm thinking, it's amazing that we're still here. What with the scientist inventing the nuclear bomb, who thought, gee, maybe when we drop the bomb, the atmosphere will burn up and we'll all die. Yet they dropped it anyway. Tesla thought, gee, my broadcasting of power might split the world in two. When astronomer Tom Van Flandern told us of his theory that the asteroid belt between Mars and Jupiter was once a planet that exploded some 3 million years ago, the question comes up, well, Tom, could that have been natural means, or were there some stupid humans there at one time, or humanoids? You wonder if...
I've often wondered.
Yeah. Was there some technology where they just didn't check it out well enough and went ahead and flipped the switch and voila, no more planet? Yeah. You start going from the realm of the science fiction into the realm of the possible. It gets real blurry. It gets a real interesting territory to contemplate. But anyway, Tesla must have also ascertained that no, the world wasn't going to split in two. But he actually, who knows, he never really got his tower up and running. That was an arrested project, wasn't it?
Oh, yes, it was. I really believe that he was more of a moralist than that.
Me too.
He conducted these experiments in Central Park, and he approached the problem gradually, in degrees. You remember that by the time he gets to Colorado, the transmitter that he's using is almost 100 feet in diameter, and using towers 200 feet high. Basically, his idea was to approach this problem in steps and then check it out. And if it proved that it was going to be dangerous or hazardous, he was going to abandon it. Mm-hmm. That's all. Basically, it was a test. He called it his experimental station. It wasn't intended to be a working station for industrial use. This was an experimental prototype, and he conducted a year's worth of experiments there to ascertain whether this should be done, whether it could be done, what would be the results of it.
And who was financing all of this?
Well, he was getting money from JP. Mm-hmm. He was getting money from JP Morgan. I think very strongly that he was playing this card with JP Morgan. Morgan just gave him money to get him out of his hair after a while. By this time, JP Morgan was setting up an electrical company which we know as GE.
Ah.
Anything that has the name General in front of it is a Morgan company. That should make some thoughts swirl. General Motors, General Mills. Anyway, what Morgan was doing in the meantime was seeking out geniuses such as Carl Steinmetz, who could interpret Teslian science and duplicate it where possible, especially duplicating the obsolescent parts of his technology so that Morgan could use his power line technology, of which he was now the sole monopoly.
Oh, I see.
So basically,
still need to find a power source to fire it up and start making
well,
it.
yeah, they had to break Tesla's patent on polyphased alternating current generators. So, and Steinmetz was called in to do this.
Kind of back engineer it.
Right, and basically what they impressed on the country was a backwards form. It wasn't Tesla's most recent, most thrilling discovery. It was just an obsolescent form of energy that we're still using, simply because of brute force. It's been forced on us. Mm-hmm. And this is something that Tesla strove to eliminate all his life.
Now, why is that?
Well, because he saw the benefits of using his radiant energy. It had so many thrilling applications. It would have taken us into the realms of what we would call the future, a better world.
Applications plus this
Sure.
was his consciousness enhancing. Could you explain that one?
Oh, definitely. Well, for example, when Tesla discovered the pressure effect, as he increased the pulse rate, he discovered that he could push objects around with this energy. So you beam the energy at something on wheels and it moves.
It's hard to imagine, but go ahead.
Well, it's hard to imagine. Eric Dollard has performed experiments which he's got on video.
So you don't have to take Eric Dollard's word for it. You can actually see these on video.
Yes.
And have you duplicated or replicated some of these?
Well, I haven't, because I really don't. I don't focus my research on electricity or ethericity. Mm-hmm. I'm basically researching radionics and remote viewing technology and things like this.
Yeah, well, there's a future discussion here to be had, obviously.
Right. Earth energies. I'm more intrigued with Earth energies and their, and their availability for use.
But quick question.
Yeah.
You've read, and this is your interpretation of what Tesla was really doing. You've read the archives, you read the interviews, you read his notes, you read everything you can get your hands on. Yeah. And you have the added benefit of Eric Dollard, who you believe truthfully replicated these experiments.
Absolutely.
So you're convinced these all happened?
Oh, yes. Okay. I am, yes. As a matter of fact, Eric did a demonstration which was absolutely flabbergasting, using a small Tesla transmitter, and he applied the current, the ether current, to a vacuum bulb. He was able to pull a piece of copper in towards the lamp. And actually, when you place your hands around these bulbs, you feel a pressure pushing you away.
So you've been there in the lab and you felt this yourself?
Excuse me?
You've been there and you felt this yourself?
Well, people on the video were reporting this. I felt similar things when I was about 18 or 19. I was building some of these devices, and I felt similar effects. But I believe that Eric has gotten the effects to a higher degree of efficiency, so they're stronger.
Okay.
And so Tesla also reports this, this thrusting phenomenon. So we can only imagine what he was going to do ultimately with this. He does describe heavier-than-air ships. And one wonders if he was not, in fact, using these bulbs as levitating projectors. And that's just, that's open for speculation. And, of course, we would have to back that up by experimental verification.
But one could suggest that perhaps there was a technology that would seem like science fiction today that we just narrowly missed.
Absolutely. Also, the beaming of energy, for example, to distant, for example, if one wanted to defend one's borders, you would have this energy and just focus it on any incoming hostile missile, let's say. And Tesla talked about this, the ability to wipe out any kind of incoming offense weapon, or to defend the borders of the country, destroying subs and so forth.
And wireless communication, wireless transportation, wireless...
Well, yes. And what he wanted to basically do was make energy available for use at any point on the globe. Now, how he would do this, well, maybe we should talk about his magnifying transmitter in Colorado, and then we'll proceed from there.
Go ahead.
When Tesla built this one particular transmitter and tied it into the ground, he discovered a truly amazing thing. And this is not explicitly stated anywhere in his transcripts, because he privatized and secretized a lot of this. But if you look through his diary notes, you'll find an amazing sequence of descriptions. And one is, when it came to photographing the discharges inside the laboratory, Tesla said that it took sometimes upwards of 15 to 20 minutes to get enough of an exposure on the plates that they were using at the time to make any kind of impression. Whereas Tesla always said that the brilliance of the discharges to the human eye were startling. It was almost like sunlight.
So why would it expose quicker?
Right. So what we're talking about here is a type of light which is more nearly in keeping with the idea of the human aura and with the ether. So there's a mystery right there. Secondly, the fact that you'd have to take 15 to 20 minutes to get an exposure on any of the plates is a clue to subsequent descriptions which he gives. And we see pictures where the plate is absolutely covered in sparks. The photograph is absolutely covered in sparks, like a fountain of sparks. And the caption reads, "Discharge, the result of a 1-second close of the switch." Which means he closed the switch for a second and opened it. And for 15 or 20 minutes, this discharge was going on without any input. So basically, what he's telling us in his secretive way, his cryptic manner, is that once you start the process of pulling ether up as a fountain, the ether continues flowing for upwards of 15 or 20 minutes. And so basically what he was doing was jump-starting the ether fountain. And this energy would flow up as a fountain and would just continue flowing. And this was what he called his stationary wave. Now, what was the wave? The wave was the fountain, the gushing fountain that came up right through the earth. And the other waves that he had to contend with were the electron waves that kept jamming his system. And he had to figure out ways of dispersing that energy because that could build up to an enormously dangerous value. We're talking about amperage.
Okay, you could have a big static electricity charge ready to pop out.
He didn't want that, you see. Most people don't realize that who study his work. He didn't want the static discharge. That was dangerous. That could cause fires. Or worse, it could kill people.
So
he wanted ways of dispersing that.
Can you tell us some more about what Tesla was really doing?
Oh, yes.
Trying to power the world and how.
Right. Well, we've discussed his magnifier transmitter, and that was basically the idea that 1 second's worth of an applied electrical burst could pull up 20 minutes or more of ether power, radiant energy. So this was his magnifying transmitter. It would magnify this effect. Now, once he had this power, the idea was to broadcast it liberally to the world. And so if you...
And not charge for it. This was supposed to be free energy.
Well, I suppose he could meter it at the source, at the reception site. I'm sure he had planned to eventually meter it at some point. But it seemed that he was describing a utopian system, or at least he was portrayed as wanting to do that.
At least it would have been clean energy.
It was clean energy. Basically, once you got the reaction going, all you had to do is balance the upwelling ether fountain, come up like a gusher. And, of course, he also described that certain places would be better suited to pull up the ether fountains.
Due to geography or some sort
geology.
of world grid? Okay, geology.
Yeah, geology, and so he had to manage the ether fountain effect and the electrostatic drag effect. And once that was balanced, he could manage the energy. Now imagine being a consumer. Basically, what Tesla described was just an aerial, a radiant energy receiver, and a little power pack in the basement.
Oh, on the receiving end. You just need a little aerial to pull it in, and then a little power pack to convert it to whatever form of electricity, be it heat or form of power, be it heat or electricity or the pulling, pushing, whatever.
Right.
Okay.
So basically, I believe he wanted to just keep it as ether power, and this would mean that your home and my home would have wireless lights. I mean, this is the amazing thing to the people who used to come to Tesla's laboratory in the Soho area of New York.
Oh, you described that with us last time.
Yeah.
Tell us again some of the inventions people would see.
Well, his laboratory was magnificent. A typical iron and stone brick building of the period had several floors, perhaps 4 or 5. The first floor would be a large gallery, and Tesla had small little exhibitions set up. People could come in freely, walk in and out. Sometimes he'd show up on his way out to lunch, I'm sure, and just give demonstrations for the kids. But you had to imagine also that this was a district which was, at that time, close to the northernmost limits of the city, certainly the most luxurious and artistically rich section of the city. So this Tesla laboratory was kind of an anomaly in the area, where jewels and furs and rich restaurants and clothiers had their shops. And
Samuel Clemens and figures of the day dropping by.
Oh, yes, all the time. And when they would come in and visit Tesla, basically they were there to visit the future, because they'd walk in and they'd find large spherical globe-shaped lamps, brilliantly illuminated without a single wire connected to anything. In certain cases, if the temperature in the rooms were uncomfortably cold, all Tesla would have to do is turn the dial, and the air would become instantly heated through pulsation energy.
So he had a microcosm of this set up in his lab, obviously.
Oh, yes, and he also, of course, he developed vocal wireless radio. I mean, he was communicating with transmitter receiver setups on boats, which were traveling up and down the Hudson. He could transmit 20 miles or more, and his transmitters were very compact and small, basically, because the transmitting section was not an aerial. It wasn't a wire. It was a globe. It was a lamp, and the energy came out of the lamp like light rays that could go through everything. And so basically these were his transmitters, his radiant energy transmitters. You have to understand that what he was transmitting was a different form of energy altogether. And so he really rarely used wire antennas of any kind. They were usually little compact globes or tubes when he wanted to beam the energy.
Let me tell you an interesting story. We'll have a guest on coming up. I don't know when he's going to schedule. David Solomon, whose father met Seti in Egypt, who took him down into this secret tomb in Saqqara, I believe it was. No, Abydos.
Oh, yeah.
And some of the things that he reports seeing were globes that lit on their own, illuminating the whole room without any form of electricity powering them. I also heard from another friend of mine that in the diaries of Napoleon's archaeologists that they had seen standing globes illuminated with no visible like neon lights, but what powered them, who knows, that the soldiers knocked over and so destroyed the last remaining extant lamps. So you hear about ancient technology using something, and you wonder, well, it couldn't have been electricity, but there's many forms of energy. We just happened on electricity, but if you look at the whole spectrum of energy, it's a lot there that could have been played with and utilized, perhaps. But you hear these stories and you wonder, was Tesla onto something that ancient people had come on before? Also, we want to talk about, Gerry, how you mentioned that Tesla believed that this technology was trying to put together and beam to the world was consciousness enhancing. How was that so? Why did Tesla think that? We'll get to that. But and what was Tesla's vision for the future? He envisioned a utopian form of energy. What was his vision? What was he trying to accomplish on a social agenda? Let's talk about that. But first, this is something that you said no one ever talks about with Tesla. Few people have realized this, but Tesla saw some very unusual byproducts, after effects, in his laboratory when he turned this kind of radiant energy on. What were they?
Well, one thing was in the early days when he operated the radiant energy transmitters in his laboratory in New York, he noticed that once he turned these transmitters off, the power didn't stop, and that was the magnifying transmitter principle in action. In other words, he could light up wireless lamps to full candle power and operate motors long after the transmitter had been deactivated. And he also noticed that his mind and his body were strangely cleared of any kind of negativity or any kind of resistance, and would give himself therapeutic exposures to this kind of radiant energy. He and his technicians would sit in front of these globes for maybe a half an hour at a time, sometimes an hour or more. In his case, he'd fall asleep in front of these things. And he found that they had germicidal properties. In other words, they could, if you were coming down with something, if you were feeling ill, suddenly you'd feel better again after the exposure. But the most important part of his discovery in this regard was the enhancing or elevation of consciousness. And one imagines that he would expose his technicians, who sometimes were bumbling idiots, to these rays just to elevate their awareness. So he was very cognizant of the fact that he had found the means to achieve that goal which he originally set out to find, and that was the connection point between metaphor, vision, metaphysical world reality, and physical world reality. So now, when he operated his magnifying transmitter in Colorado, you have to understand that this is tremendous energy. I mean, this is a huge flow of etheric energy. And what Tesla describes in his diary is really fantastic because, in a very matter-of-fact way, he says a very extraordinary number of things. Number one, he describes the fact that after running the transmitter, the air all around the station assumes a crystal clarity of a rare kind. For example, he describes seeing persons with great detail traveling on trains, passengers on trains 10 miles away, where you could literally see these people's faces.
So he was actually looking out the window. A train was 10 miles in the distance.
Yeah.
And somehow he was able to get a picture. Did he check it out?
He could literally see the train, see the spokes on the wheels, and see the faces of the passengers 10 miles away. Whereas, on the other hand, a person at the foot of the hill could not be seen. They looked awfully small.
So perception was altered somehow.
So yes, there's like an optical distortion going on as a result of the ether flow, which meant to Tesla that the ancient science was absolutely right on.
Okay.
Like the Persians, probably. Now, Tesla was a great aficionado of Persian mythology and Arabian folktales. And so his vision of the future was a world like Aladdin's lamp, basically. The idea of wireless power for the world, flying machines through the skies, drawing power from power transmitters, nations that didn't have to worry about foreign invaders because they were all defended by power beams, pollution-free vehicles, safe ocean travel, broadcast therapy for public health, where you could literally destroy germs from miles away just by a broadcast, and do it selectively. A thing which Dr. Raymond Rife, later reproduced with great success in the 30s.
And we'll have to talk about that at a later date.
Oh, yes. And so Tesla also, of course, now the hidden agenda was something which he brings forward in an essay, one of his greatest essays, entitled The Problem of Increasing Human Energy, which most people totally misunderstand because they don't understand the phrase human energy.
This was the code word for his radiant energy?
Well, human energy was a code word for the human aura, or consciousness.
Okay.
And it was used by Dr. Albert Abrams at the turn of the century, who also found that it was possible to change mental states with electrical stimulations. So this was corroborated by many people, you know, and Tesla basically describes the progression of helping humanity. For example, he said humanity needs food, but food won't elevate consciousness. Humanity needs fuel, but fuel won't elevate human consciousness. And humanity needs education and government, but none of those will really elevate consciousness on a mass scale. And he says the need of humanity, the fundamental need as we move into the future, is an elevated consciousness, an awareness of the world as it is, a metaphysical awareness.
And perhaps this could be assisted by a particular device.
Absolutely. And so this is the principal reason why he built Wardenclyffe in Long Island. And he had planned, he called it his communication system, but basically what he was going to communicate to the world was a
enhanced consciousness.
Yes, an elevated consciousness as the primary function. Then, of course, he had all the other applications: telephone exchange, wireless telephone exchange, and
that would be a carrier wave for all these other practical benefits.
Exactly.
So he believed that this was going to elevate consciousness because of his own experience sitting in his laboratory in this fountain of ether.
Right.
He noticed that it had a germicidal effect. His body felt better. His mind felt more clear, not only with him but his assistants, and he also had enhanced perceptive abilities.
Right, vitalizing. He felt, he described it as a nerve tonic. One would imagine it was almost like taking B12 shots. Vitalizing effect. It's an interesting thing, too. Tesla lived well on into his 80s. A lot of people accuse him that his tubes were prolific generators of X-rays, but they're not X-rays the way we know it. Otherwise, he would have died, at a young age, but he didn't. As a matter of fact, I have this on personal testimony. A friend of mine, a very dear friend of mine with whom I grew up in the neighborhood, whose father, they were Yugoslavians, and whose father, as a young immigrant, sought Tesla out in his later years, and was finally too embarrassed to actually approach Tesla in person, but waited outside the Hotel New Yorker because it was said Tesla would come out every day about 4 o'clock for his daily constitutional. So Mr. Sinosia and his friend would wait outside the door, and out came Tesla, tall man, impressive figure, in his 80s, long blue coat, cane in hand, walking at top speed up toward uptown, and they just couldn't keep up with him. Hmm. Now, the way Tesla's portrayed, he's this obscure,
eccentric,
poverty-stricken person.
Germophobic.
Of course, the question is, why is he walking uptown with a big smile on his face at top speed? They can't keep up with him. He's so healthy. They can't keep up with him. What's he doing living in the Hotel New Yorker, which at the time was the Art Deco hotel of the city? And what was he doing owning 2 penthouses?
Tell me.
We find that one of the penthouses was a laboratory. He never stopped working. And basically, after, the Wardenclyffe Tower was torn down, and it just seemed that the legal process, the legal machinery was after Tesla to destroy Wardenclyffe just a few weeks before he had it running.
What was the story? What was the demise of Wardenclyffe? And this was the big tower that was going to beam to the world this radiant, consciousness-enhancing energy.
Well,
the story goes that Tesla said to Morgan, well, we're going to give energy to the world and not charge for it. And Morgan said, oh, no, we've got a meter for it, and put a stop to it. That's the general story that goes out.
That's part of it. I think also it was realized that he was planning to do other things with this energy. And,
with a little consciousness raising. So wrong.
Yeah. I think people who
you can tell me the doctors are all threatened. We need sick people, or we're out of business.
Right. And financiers need the ignorance of humanity so that they can continually dupe them.
If people think too clearly, they're less easy to fool.
Right. So apparently what happened was Tesla lost out. They chain little, and 2 or 3 weeks before the tower was supposed to be up and running, Morgan again, his son this time, closed the place down and then had it dynamited.
How would Morgan be able to come in, walk in? Was Tesla out of money? I mean, how do you legally go in and do that?
Well, he was funding it at this point. He was funding it.
Okay.
And, Tesla was promising the younger Morgan a share of the profits. And he was saying, I expect within a month to make up the entire loan you've given me. And, of course, if you think about what Tesla was talking about, he could have done it if it had been allowed to operate. Now, the question is, why would Morgan shut it down?
This is the big question.
Yeah, Tesla was talking about a wireless telephone exchange that was very much like what we are using satellites to do nowadays, only his station was ground-based. He was using the Earth as a matrix to send countless signals. I mean, he describes it as millions of channels, that he could use millions of channels. Remember, he was using ether energy, and he discovered principles of action in the ether that we don't even know about. I mean, I can't even speculate on this because I don't know that much about this part of it. I've guessed a lot of this part of it, but what I'm imagining is that he was stimulating the natural ether of streams in the earth and using them. And these would be like thread-like streams. Mm-hmm. Of course, now in his later years, Tesla had miniaturized the ether transmitter and the ether magnifier to the point where in a compact device about the size of maybe an old shortwave radio, a more portable one, like a transoceanic, a Zenith model, with which many people are familiar, he was able to pull in power from the cosmos and light lamps and run motors and activate heaters and do all the sort of things that utilities are supposed to do. And he was supposed to bring this information to President Roosevelt and passed away a week before that meeting.
Now, Gerry, when you say that a miniature and portable receiver of this,
right,
would that have been necessary to have the tower up to transmit this radiant energy, this etheric energy?
Well, this is after Wardenclyffe. Now, after Wardenclyffe, Tesla was really plunged into obscurity by the GE company and by this whole media blitz that was out to dehumanize him basically and just wipe him out, brand him as a fraud, as everything wrong.
So that could explain why we barely hear about Tesla today, despite the hundreds of patents and the very considerable inventions and the fact that we use alternating current today.
Sure. GE basically replaced Tesla's polyphase AC system, and Marconi was used to cover up all the work in radiant energy.
Radio.
With his own blend of radio, which basically, of Marconi, I have very little to say in nice terms. Basically, Marconi stole most of the things he worked with from others all around him, and never mentioned Tesla, never, in any of his journals, never mentioned him, even when he was robbing from him openly. And so what was happening was that the media were being used by the financial forces to drown Tesla. Tesla was really plunged into a hellish time for about 20 years, where he had no funds. He went from hotel to hotel, living on potatoes, I guess, and graham crackers, and the kindness of people such as Dr. Hammond in Massachusetts, who held Tesla to be an elder mentor, and had Tesla live in his castle for upwards of about a year, or maybe more, where they both worked on remote control and robotics and these kind of applications for war technology. Then Tesla came back to New York City and suddenly shows up with all this money coming in, and he's living in the New Yorker hotel. Now, what probably happened at this point was RCA. RCA was the company that took over the Marconi company, and the Marconi radio system was so plagued with problems that they needed a genius to sort it out.
Oh, so they turned to Tesla.
They turned to Tesla, and Sarnoff was so odious a man that he wouldn't even permit Tesla's name to be mentioned. And so Tesla was hired under another name. He took his mother's name, Turbo, and Terbo, and his signature basically, his brand is basically seen on a number of radio receivers of that time period in which he was working with RCA.
Turbo, but not Tesla. You're saying?
Well, Tesla was working on these radio receivers, and you can see his signature on the designs, because basically they're all Tesla coils on the inside. There are all these spiral coils, and there's very few other components. And,
okay, so quick question before we have to go to. You said he went to go to President Roosevelt. His plan was to show him the device and get government support.
Yes.
And Roosevelt would have been a good choice here.
Sure.
And Tesla mysteriously died, or natural death, or who knows?
Well, I believe it was a natural death. I won't claim conspiracy here. I think he died of a natural death. He was in his middle 80s, early 80s, actually.
Why did it take him so long to set up this meeting with Roosevelt, especially if Tesla knew, here's one chance to give this technology to why let it die with him? Why didn't he just hurry up the meeting?
Well, perhaps he had just perfected it. He had demonstrated this, and his nephew, Peter Savo, was a witness of this development. Tesla had an electric car which was powered by this power receiver, which consisted of 12 or more tubes, possibly radioactively stimulated tubes, which enabled the car to go for miles at high speeds upstate New York. And they drove and tested this car. Lee DeForest witnessed this car in action. He examined it. Lee was a friend of Tesla's. And by the way, Tesla was by far not an eccentric who hated people. He was very
telling a lot of the rumors about
Tesla.
He
was a very warm-hearted person towards the end of his life.
Gerry, let's type a few loose ends. You could mention also the romance of Tesla, his love life played into all of these politics as well. And then I do want to spend considerable time taking phone calls. I'm sure our listeners have many, many questions for you.
Well, as a result of his partnership with Westinghouse in his younger years, Tesla became fabulously wealthy. And he dined every day at Delmonico's. He had his own table there, his own chef, his own silverware. His own cuisine suited to his tastes. He had a coach waiting outside. He dressed elegantly. He dined sumptuously, and he had excellent taste in the people that he would associate with. Now, Samuel Clemens, Mark Twain, was one of his best friends. He also was frequently visited by Enrico Caruso, Anton Dvorak, the composer, Paganini. All of these people were his friends. And, of course, in these circles, he, of course, would meet debutantes, and he'd be invited to these wonderful parties uptown in the mansions. And in one of these parties, he was quite captivated by a young woman by the name of Catherine Underwood Johnson, and he just fell hopelessly in love with her, and she with him too. It was quite mutual. It was magnetic.
Why didn't they marry?
Well, he went calling at her home, as was the custom, probably flowers in hand, and was greeted at the door by a very elderly gentleman whom he assumed was her father, but who turned out to be her husband. Ouch. And so the two of them, although they didn't carry on a love affair, they were still infatuated and continued in a very tight kind of relationship where, for example, Tesla and Catherine would communicate by personal courier up to 10 times a day.
Okay.
Okay, so, and of course, Tesla, being very gallant, befriended Robert, who also was the publisher of Century magazine. So we assume that Catherine and Robert were an arranged marriage.
Mm-hmm.
And Tesla became the third wheel, I guess, at the Underwood mansion.
So Robert accepted Tesla into the circle of.
Yeah, I don't think he really suspected what was the tension going on between Tesla and Catherine.
And how long did this go on?
Oh, all his life.
Oh, she and he carried on this correspondence.
All his life.
All his life, okay.
And of course, when he had to bring it to an end, and this was a turning point in Tesla's life. You can imagine the loneliness of the man. I've seen photographs of Catherine. She was radiant beauty, crystalline eyes, just a beautiful woman. And, Tesla was certainly eligible. He was magnetic. And when he would walk into the Waldorf, the Palm Room, when he would walk into the first floor with the fountains and the harpists playing and all the debutantes sitting around waiting to be noticed, Tesla would just breeze right in, and he would acknowledge all the beauties and just go right to his table, usually. On several occasions, a young lady used to drop her handkerchief, and he would just quickly sweep it up and give it to her. That was Anne Morgan. She was an infatuated adolescent who just followed him around everywhere. Of course, she didn't realize that he had a different or deeper interest in an older woman, older than she, that is. And so Tesla was cool and indifferent with Anne. He didn't see much depth in her. She was just a child, really, at the time. But as she was getting older, she was getting very adamant that she was like helplessly in love with him. And she just followed him everywhere. So one imagines that this, coupled with Tesla's discoveries in radiant energy, might have had something to do with Father Morgan's disapproval of Tesla, to say the least. But the love affair with Catherine was very tragic, because Tesla was a gentleman and he wasn't about to break any rules.
Mm-hmm.
So of course, a lot of people had questions. Why isn't this guy getting married? All the questions that are asked.
So he kept this it was requited, but it was a not possible love affair all of his life, you're saying.
Well, yes, and of course it was killing him.
Mm-hmm.
It was killing him. One wonders whether or not this is one of the reasons why he went as far as Colorado to do his experiments, to get away from this. And she would write to him, and the letters were quite passionate and quite demanding after a while. Why won't you come and see me? Why won't you see us? We miss you, And he wouldn't answer them. And finally, Catherine passed away.
Before
as they got older, and Robert outlived Catherine,
The older husband.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you for explaining the love affair. I want to mention that we'd mentioned that Gerry has directions because you play around with all these earth energies. You're a natural for this. To explain to us what Tesla was doing, trying to power the earth and sticking light bulbs in the ground and can power them and all this, because you yourself play around with all these energies into the earth. I still remember the rock music that you and Michael Thoreau played for me.
That's right.
Different tones that they'd recorded from natural earth vibrations going through different metals. Oh, I said a new definition of rock music. One of my better lines. They look very simple. I read through them. Basically, take a copper pipe, put it in the ground at a certain place. You say where green things grow, so you can. That's an indication a lot of good earth energy are going on in that spot. Attach a wire to it, give you instructions, attach that to your radio, and you say your radio reception will increase greatly.
Absolutely.
So,
Shortwave radio especially will produce enormous volumes of stations with great strength and usually static free.
Oh, interesting. So hopefully this will help those people who maybe the radio station that carries the show is just out of range to receive that station. Maybe it'll help increase the reach of the show. That is our hope. Thank you for that, Gerry. So just want to mention that what he spoke about last time he was visiting with us, we now have that information, and it's free for the asking. Any last things you want to say before we take a break and then start in with some phone calls?
Certainly. I really have to give credit to Eric Dollard, who is a fantastic radio engineer and an experimenter. I mean, if it were not for Eric's work, I certainly would never have looked Tesla up again. I was firmly convinced that Tesla was just a mistaken inventor who was misinterpreting things. And this is as a result of my academic training in the 70s. From the 60s to the 70s, I became disenchanted with Tesla because I wasn't able to reproduce any of his effects. And the harder I tried, the more impossible it seemed. Eric was the first person really on the scene to properly interpret Tesla technology and duplicate it. And with his limited means...
Financially, you mean?
Well, financially and frustrations, the endless frustrations which have come his way,
Borderland has this video?
Oh, yes, there's two of them. Longitudinal electricity, and the other one is transverse electricity, or dielectricity, something like that.
Mm-hmm.
Mike Thoreau can inform people on this best. And Eric also published a treatise called Wireless Power, which basically details Tesla's wireless power schemes, and there's mathematical equations there for those who are interested, and descriptive paragraphs. Well, see, if it wasn't for Eric, we wouldn't know this stuff. So he really should get the credit for all of it.
And isn't it interesting that one individual can accomplish this? I see this over and over and over. You've said that the HEART project, while they're attempting to provide energy and take this actually solar stream energy that Earth is a reservoir of and turn this into electricity, they're missing the boat here on what Tesla was doing.
Oh, absolutely. They're going about it all the wrong way.
But one gentleman, Eric Dollard, could figure out what Tesla was really doing and managed to recreate these effects?
Absolutely.
So it takes just one individual. And how is HAARP missing the boat?
Well, they're not using the pulsating ether currents that Tesla was employing to stimulate the Earth's etheric reservoir. What they're doing is they're trying to use the electrons in the aurora borealis rather than using the ether streams which cause them. All of modern science is built on this idea of electrons.
Well, they're not recognizing this gaseous etheric layer.
They don't believe it exists.
Got it. So the other question really quick is, if Tesla noticed that at a certain pulse rate, we're talking about a certain vibration or frequency of pulsing, that it was irritating, and then other pulses were enhancing and had different effects, then would it not be dangerous to have this set up where somebody would say, oh, let's just irritate the heck out of everyone? You know, who knows? I mean, we don't really trust the powers that be all the time. They don't always have our best interests at heart, it seems.
Well, I think...
Or they're operating off a different page than the rest of us. Sometimes you get that impression.
Well, I think you'd know it if they were doing that, because it would be a terrible feeling. I mean, it's like being electrocuted. Basically, the pulsations determine how much this etheric energy will interact with matter.
And, of course, you'd say they would be affected by it, too. So why not just gear it towards the life-enhancing frequencies?
Exactly.
Wouldn't that be smart? And what about Eric Dollard? And this is not for the general viewer. This is for, or is it, Eric Dollard?
Well, yeah, I think his experimental videos are very accessible to anybody. They're easy to understand.
Okay, and then how do people get those?
They would call Mike Thoreau at Borderland.
Okay, phone number?
707-825-7733.
Sacramento, listening to KST. Hi, Graham. Thanks for joining us. You're on with Gerry Vassilatos.
I'm not a scientist like the gentleman on your show. I'm just a swell writer and researcher. But a while back, I came across Nikola Tesla in a wonderful book called The People's Almanac by David Wolochinsky and Irving Wallace. David Wolochinsky is really David Wallace. He's Irving Wallace's son. You know of Irving Wallace, I'm sure, the famous writer. But it was very interesting to me about it. And I heard something that is sort of a rumor. It's not a fact, I guess, because nobody knows what happened to it. But some say that Tesla caused that disaster at Tunguska in Siberia in the early part of this century. What do you say about that?
Well, I think that stems from the writings of Tom Bearden.
Of who?
Mr. Tom Bearden.
Oh, really?
Thomas Bearden, yeah.
Uh-huh.
And I differ with his opinion on that. I really do. The Tunguska explosion was really the result of a comet, most likely, that landed in Siberia.
Even though some of the Russians think it was a spaceship.
Well, perhaps, yeah.
That's way out of your field, right?
Well, not really. I mean, I did study geophysics in college. The Tunguska blast really had nothing to do with Nikola Tesla. It's often equated because of the time frame. But you see, etheric energy couldn't do that. The ether energy could not really do that kind of work. Ether energy, mostly at the frequencies Tesla was using, it would be more or less like a life-enhancing energy. So
he said it could push and pull things then.
Yeah, unless he. Yeah,
I really explosive. It doesn't go kaboom.
My personal feeling is that that's not what happened.
Do you think it was a comet or a...
Yeah, it was probably a comet.
Yeah.
What do you call it? A meteor?
Or an asteroid, perhaps an asteroid.
Thank you, Graham, for the question. Chris is in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. Hi.
Hi, hello, Gerry.
Hello.
And Laura, how you doing?
Hi, good.
Jerry, have you considered that Tesla's AC motors may occur in nature?
How so?
You know, there's alternating current fish.
Oh, how interesting.
I'm not aware of that. No, elucidating that. One of my sources say that the frequency of the AC fish is frequencies as high as 2,000, but most range between 50 and 60 CPS, cycles per second.
What species of fish is this?
There are numerous knife fish. If you go to any animal shop, any pet shop in America, you can buy these little freshwater fish, and they're alternating current fish.
Huh.
It's fascinating. Dozens and dozens of species, and there's also triple phase current fish, triple phasic fish.
Oh, that's really important.
Do you have any more examples? Tell us what. Hold the line. We had Chris in Fort Lauderdale on the phone. Chris, are you back?
Yes.
You were just telling us about examples in nature of fish using AC power, and now another type of fish using triple-phasic. So what is triple-phasic, and Gerry, why is that significant to this discussion?
Well, I'm wondering the exact purpose of the fish using this kind of energy, but it is very, very important to our understanding of why, for example, Tesla arbitrarily chose 60 cycle AC.
That's what I was thinking, yeah.
You know, this is something that Michael Thoreau and I have been deeply involved in trying to understand for a couple of weeks now, because it has impact on another topic altogether. But I'd like information on this if possible.
Well, one of my sources says, my original source says it was 50 to 60 CPS, but after talking to a biophysicist in Florida International University, I think it was, he says the frequency is higher than that. He believes the frequency is higher than that. So I have conflicting information on that.
By much or by a little, or?
I don't recall. I have it written down somewhere. I think it was like 160 or something. I'm just guessing.
But, Chris, what did the fish use the currents for?
Electrolocation. That's the current thinking. Boom, boom, boom. On what they're using the AC for. That not only do they produce alternating current, but they also have sites, ports on their bodies that can detect electricity, so they can send out an electric field, and if there's anything in that field, either conductive or insulating.
There are certain.
So it gives them a roadmap of their environment, and it's kind of like sonar echolocation, only they're using it as electrical current. Is that what you're saying?
Correct. It's not echolocation. It's electrolocation. It's similar.
Okay.
Correct. And,
thank you.
But I'm also wondering if not the motor effect itself is not evolving from nature. Did Tesla plagiarize nature, or is nature plagiarizing Tesla?
Oh, no. Indeed, Tesla would agree with you that he was plagiarizing nature. In fact, that was one of his mottos. Learn from nature. He was quoting Goethe.
Oh, I love it.
You know, he was quoting Goethe. He said, let nature be your teacher and imitate nature. Because he wished to be in harmony with nature. You see, he was trying to produce a technology that was in harmony. In fact, direct current of the type that Edison was involved in could not possibly survive because Tesla believed that it was anti-natural and that vibration was more in keeping with nature. So that's why he got into AC for a while. Yes, I was just going to say, then he got into pulsating DC, which was really the application of vibration to DC, which is a lot more like what nature does in neurology, for example. Yeah.
And what about the story of Tesla driving a Pierce Arrow 90 miles an hour with no fuel?
That's the one.
It is. Tachyon energy?
That was the one. That was well. What we call tachyons nowadays is what Tesla would have called ether.
Ether, yes.
Same thing.
Okay.
So ether and tachyon are the same thing.
Probably, yeah.
Uh-huh.
Neutrinos, you might call them.
Yeah.
You know, this kind of thing. The essential thing was finding a substance that could stop them, because they went through everything. So the idea was to find something with a cross section that was dense enough to stop them.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, Tesla saw in substances like bismuth and uranium evidence. In other words, his theory on radioactivity was that certain atoms have such a dense cross-section that when this energy comes in from space, it literally bombards them until they shatter.
Yeah.
And that was his theory for radiation or radioactivity.
Do you agree with that, Gerry?
Yeah.
I think there's some merit to that.
Oh, absolutely. I think there's no plausibility in this theory that nuclei just spontaneously explode. I can't see that.
Well, now, if you have this ether, these particles going through things, is that not like cosmic rays or gamma rays that are dangerous? I mean, you have particles zipping through you. Wouldn't they be causing a little damage?
Well, the cosmic rays and the heavier particles are what Tesla would call densified or condensed matter. The ether was so fine. See, we really don't have a conception
That it goes
of
through
it.
you and it does.
More in keeping with your thoughts. See, ether was...
Oh, so it's going to be down there with quantum physics and it's going to operate on those rules, and so it's going to be very much guided or influenced by consciousness.
Exactly.
Non-locality, can be in two places. All those different laws that we attribute to consciousness, and scientists in quantum physics say, oh, these are properties of the quantum physics world. They seem to be pretty identical.
Well, Tesla also found that you could direct this flow by using very, very high voltage electrostatic fields. So if you could give it a direction, you could make it flow in a certain direction. You could warp space, warp perception. You could affect enhanced consciousness, enhanced vitality. All of these wondrous things were the outgrowths of his understanding in this, you see. And of course, towards the end of his life, he didn't have to have the gigantic towers where he was spark jumping or jump starting the Earth.
I was trying to ask you about that earlier.
Yeah, well, he was using probably minute amounts of very ordinary radioactive substances because they gave off particles whose energies at a crystal, for example, in a crystalline lattice, we're talking about voltages in the billions of volts. So he could do it on a minute scale using natural substances and then tap that energy.
Without the tower.
Without the tower, he didn't need to jumpstart the
Well,
Earth.
then how do we know what he actually did in his later experiments?
Well, I have a very dear friend and great experimenter, Dan Winter, in Portland, Oregon. I'm sure he's listening, and he performed a really important experiment years ago involving radioactive substances and crystals, in which he obtained power outputs that literally went through the ceiling. Real simple. So, and of course, you have Thomas Henry Moray with his development of semiconductor, radiation-doped semiconductors, where he was providing a cold form, this cold white energy that could illuminate maybe 20, 30, 40 lamps to full candle power.
And
free.
The mainstream sciences, all these people were frauds because they just weren't understanding, nor did they have any basis for understanding what was going on.
No, it was.
Okay.
It was the plasma globes that you can buy in the stores nowadays.
Oh, okay.
Tesla's plasma globes gave off a white light, and they were soft and cool to the touch, and they used impulses or pulsations. What you buy nowadays in the stores are really high-frequency alternating current type tubes, and they don't produce the effects that Tesla was producing. So that's just a little insight into that.
Is there any of Tesla's technology that has been successfully and accurately recreated?
Not to my knowledge. You mean in widespread commercial use?
Yeah, or just any of the Tesla coils, you say, though, even those aren't tuned exactly right,
no.
so they're not exact reproductions either.
Right, because there was a gentleman by the name of Sir Oliver Lodge who misunderstood what Tesla was lecturing on, and who misinterpreted and reinterpreted what Tesla was doing, and gave his thoughts and equations and descriptions on how to build so-called Tesla coils. And they're not Tesla coils, they're Lodge coils.
They're
Tesla was
different.
Yeah, totally different. And to this day, I mean, when you buy plans to make these coils, they're not Tesla transformers. They don't produce the effects he was talking about. That's why I, as a teenager, was so disappointed.
Oh, you weren't even using the real thing.
Right, I didn't know the difference.
Well, I keep wondering, a Tesla coil, I mean, so it gives out interesting sparks of electricity. What's the point? What was Tesla trying to do with these things?
Well, first of all, it's a totally different current. And with the Lodge, I mean, if you inspect the two of them, they look the same, but they do totally different things. A Lodge coil is an alternating coil. In other words, the current pulses in one direction and then it reverses.
Mm-hmm.
And it does so maybe 100,000 times a second. With Tesla's coil, first of all, the impulse is an etheric impulse. It's not electrons.
Mm-hmm.
And what happens is you get this radiant energy coming out the top of it, but this energy comes out in continual spurts in a single direction. And because of that, it can perform work. When you have an alternation at a high frequency, you're not performing work after a while. It's not going anywhere. It's just vibrating back and forth. There's no net movement in one direction of any particles.
Okay.
With
And
Tesla,
so what kind of work would this, why did Tesla invent the Tesla coil, the authentic one, and what was it able to do?
Well, because he discovered this idea of this ether pulse that could go right through metal shields as a result of a violent spark. So what he wanted to do was make this a continual process and also to amplify it. And so he discovered by empirical work, as he was developing this thing, he was discovering facets of how to get this to happen, and he was just empirically developing his apparatus. So the coil, the Tesla transformer, came out as a result of that. So once he had that, he could produce ether pulses of a very excessive intensity, and he could also beam the energy. Eventually, he developed tubes, vacuum tubes, particularly his carbon button vacuum tubes, where he could get the energy to move in a certain direction. And that's when he got into beam technology.
Gerry, could you give us again the description of what Nikola Tesla did with melting metals by adjusting the frequency of one of his transformers? You described a certain process that subjectively was felt as he raised the frequency.
Well, yes, and the frequency we're talking about in Tesla's language, the frequency he meant was the frequency of pulsation.
Yes.
Unidirectional pulses. In other words, pulses in one direction only. He described this progressive, as the pulsations get shorter and shorter and shorter,
mm-hmm.
they will interact with matter to a certain degree. So at a very slow pulsation rate, you can feel the energy effects, and they sting. And there's a pressure wave effect with it. And as you raise the frequency, as you shorten the pulsation length, what happens is you feel pressure but no pain, like a push, like a thrust. Then as you continue, you feel warmth throughout the whole body. And as you go up from there, after the heat, you let's see what happens after that. You feel cool breezes.
Yes.
And as you go up from there, suddenly consciousness starts to clarify. The physical body gets like elevated. You feel a vitalistic sort of impulse.
Now, Pete from Portland was on the line, and Gerry, you were explaining the answer to his question. What were those various frequencies from the pulse. How frequent were these pulsing of the ether? What were the different effects that were produced? And you explained that. What else did you want to say on that?
Well, I would say this. If you wanted to melt a metal, you'd first have to calculate how much energy would be required. Of course, with ether energy, we don't know what the equations are. Maybe Eric would have something to say about that in his writings, but I haven't been able to decide.
Have you been able to melt metal?
Oh, yes.
Eric has?
Well, no, not Eric. Tesla was. Okay. Tesla was routinely doing this in demonstrations. Basically, you have to understand with a Tesla transformer, you're taking impulses, you're taking current, electrical shocks, violent discharges. And what's happening is the etheric current component is being magnified. Now, Tesla found that when he measured this, there was no current on the high voltage end. It was all voltage. There was no current there. So this is mysterious. And also the pulsations, we don't know what the pulsations were. So you're really stuck with empirical discovery there. You have to go back.
Okay, now let me ask you this. Tesla was a media star. He had demonstrations set up where anybody just about could come and attend these and witness these.
Oh, sure.
And if he was doing these extraordinary things like melting metal with a pulse of energy, why doesn't science today incorporate this kind of information? If you can only explain this through an ether theory, then why don't we have the ether theory today? How could somebody be demonstrating this in full view with the media watching and reporting this, and it's kind of ignored by science today? I don't get it. How could something's wrong here?
It's because of all the things that followed. The discrediting of Tesla, where they discredited him, they were able to reproduce some of his effects through an alternative means. In other words, using alternating currents. But they couldn't do all of the things that he talked about.
So they took what they could explain and left the rest.
They
and
could
chalked it up to alternating current.
Right. They could mimic it, and most of them were interested in patenting and making money. Mm-hmm. So they weren't really apprised of any differences. Sir Oliver Lodge was a Royal Society member, and he couldn't tell the difference between his coils, the energies from his coils, and Teslian transformers.
So this is a bit beyond even the best of them.
Except for William Crookes. Sir William Crookes was the only one who really understood that there was a difference. It was Crookes who invited Tesla to England in the first place.
Oh, how interesting. Okay, here's another connection with Crookes.
Sure.
Crookes developed the Crookes tube.
Right.
And Bill Beatty was explaining to me that this is where the X-ray was discovered, was based on an experiment with Crookes tube.
Right.
Well, in Egypt, we saw this very interesting device. This is on the cover of our catalog. And everyone says and looks at this device, and who knows if it really existed, but we do know that the Egyptians were putting on their wall images of actual apparatus they stored in these crypts, so one could surmise if it's on the wall, there was a real device that looked like this. And everyone describes it as being very much like a Crookes tube, and it's being applied to the back of people's heads. Well, then you say, well, maybe this was a technology, like a healing technology, and they were using some sort of radiant energy.
Yes.
And there's cables, and it's a bit kind of this glass bulbous tube, and there's something going on. And John Anthony West's surmising was, well, if you wanted to represent electricity or that kind of energy, this would be a wonderful way in which to do it. It gets very intriguing. So this is what's on the cover of our catalog, my picture of this device on a wall in Egypt. So there's my wonderful connection to William Crook and this ancient device. Let's see, you were talking about William Crook, and of course what else is interesting about William Crook is that he was experimenting with the paranormal, with telepathy, with levitation.
Oh, yeah.
And he was really a very accomplished scientist. I don't want to lessen his importance in his own day. I mean, he made considerable contributions and was very well respected. And he was also very much excited and curious about the fringe and doing some breakthrough research in the paranormal realm as well. So quite an interesting man. And this explains further this Egyptian device. It looks very much like a Crookes tube. Also, you're saying that William Crook was one of the few people who really understood what Tesla was actually doing.
Yeah.
And he was, you've said the ectoplasm is very akin to the ether. And so if he believed in that, then he would at least have a philosophical basis to then begin to understand Tesla, which you say necessitates a belief in the ether and understanding of the ether.
Very much
so their philosophies they look to be similarly aligned. So it's no accident he'd be one of the few to understand Tesla. Okay, so...
Yes, of course, if you read Rudolf Steiner and his students, Steiner always talked about several different types of ether. And, you have the chemical tone ether, you have the light ether, you have the heat ether, and all of these different related ethers. So, activating each one of those, you should be able to find an analogy there. Steiner's a good person to read on
and
that.
think how the world would be if Tesla had been able to put up his Wardenclyffe Tower, beam this radiant energy all over,